Dr. Naomi Kruger is a writer and senior lecturer in literature and creative writing at the University of Central Lancashire. Her debut novel, May, was published in 2018 by Sarin and highly commended in the Yeovil Novel Prize. In 2021, she was awarded an Eccles Center Fellowship at the British Library to explore transatlantic connections of faith, conversion, and emigration in early Mormonism as part of her research for her second novel. Her short fiction has been anthologized and published in literary journals. Most recently, her story, In My Father's House Are Many Mansions, which is set in a contemporary LDS chapel and explores childlessness, gender roles, and eternal polygamy, was shortlisted for the Galley Beggar Press Prize for Short Fiction. Naomi, thank you so much for being here. It is all yours.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here, and I've really enjoyed the other sessions. And there may be a little connection to all of those sessions just by serendipity in this. So see if you can spot those if you've been looking at the other sessions. So I am going to talk about the research that I've been doing for my second novel, which is historical fiction. It's set in 1842 in both Preston, which is my hometown, and Nauvoo. And I'm going to talk about where that research has taken me, the kind of questions that it's brought up, but also how it intersects with my own identity as a former Mormon. I stepped away from the community about 10 years ago. And yeah, my connection with place as well. So um, before I get started, the first slide I've got up here is the tram bridge, the old tram bridge across the River Ribble, which, as many of you probably know, was the site of the first baptisms in 1837. And the replica version of this bridge has been there for a long time and is a featured site of the Mormon history tours that are often happening in the park. And I don't know if a lot of you will know this, but the bridge has actually just been demolished. It was declared unsafe a couple of years ago. It's been out of action, and they've demolished it, and it is going to be rebuilt in a completely different style. So I was walking through the park today, and this is from this morning. That's the current view where the bridge used to be. And I was thinking about David Howlett's presentation yesterday about place and connection to place and the sacredness of spaces and how people connect to them. And I have to say that for me, I'm feeling really sad about this. I think it's good the bridge is being replaced. It's a really important footpath and cycle path. It's better to have a bridge than no bridge. But also, there's something about that view changing that is really made me quite sad. But that's just a kind of a side note. So, um, what I'm going to talk about then is how I've come to write this novel and where it's taken me. And I am going to read a little bit from it later as well. So, growing up as a Mormon in Preston, I was often reminded that I lived in a place of great historical significance. But my main exposure to LDS history, like many people, was through the standardized lesson manuals delivered on rotation and centered on the US context. And I used to get really mixed up between Nauvoo, Kirtland, Winter Quarters, Missouri. I could never get them in the right order. I didn't really listen very carefully, quite honestly. But on other less predictable occasions, so firesides, family walks, or when the American ancestors of early converts visited our ward while on church history tours, I did hear stories about the first missionaries who came in 1837, and the astonishing number of conversions that there were in Preston and the Ribble Valley, and the subsequent emigration of many of those early members, how important that was to the strengthening and the survival of the early church. So back then, as I've kind of admitted already, I was not a Mormon history enthusiast by any means. I found lessons at church repetitive, hard to engage with, and the stories about the British context were partial, hard to access, very kind of occasional. I knew I should engage with this stuff, but I was much more interested in reading novels. And I felt guilty about this for my whole teenage life. Like, why am I not as interested in the Book of Mormon as I am in novels? As a teenager, I became fascinated with 19th century British history, particularly the upheaval caused by the Industrial Revolution. I think this is because I live in a cotton town. Um, and the way that these struggles, divisions, and innovations were evoked in fiction, particularly by writers such as Elizabeth Gaskell, Charles Dickens, and George Eliot. And Andrew spoke about Silas Marner earlier, and I love that book. And its depiction, particularly of someone exiting a faith, is really interesting. Um, so Mormon history seemed to me like a separate thing, neat and parceled out, full of people who never felt as nuanced or as interesting as the characters in books. One of the most commonly retold vignettes I encountered was something that's probably familiar to a lot of people growing up in Britain, was the account of the missionaries' arrival in Preston in 1837. So, stepping off the coach, they are confronted by a lively political rally. So, you can see here Preston flag market. It looks a little bit different now, but it's still the centre of Preston, the civics and a centre of Preston. They're confronted by a lively political rally. And as Heber C. Kimball describes in his journal, I looked up and there was a large flag standing right before us, written upon it, "Truth will prevail." We spoke with one voice, amen and amen. So the missionaries adopted this as their own motto. It's a declaration of spiritual truth, motivation, and predicted future success. So it was obviously very meaningful to them, and it has echoed forward as a title both for the commemorative history of the church in Britain, produced for the sesquicentennial celebrations in 1987, and also currently for the British pageant, which is performed in both Nauvoo and Preston, but more often in Nauvoo. I might come back to that later. You can see here the obelisk, which is also visible, and I might talk about that interesting monument a little bit later as well. But what I'm going to argue is that the unintended consequence of this small act of appropriation is also to erase and obscure the specific social and political context of that rally. And by extension, the preoccupations, opinions, and loyalties of the people the missionaries found themselves surrounded by in Preston at that time. And in the book, The Pick and Flower of England by David Pickup, he suggests that the Truth Will Prevail banner might have been connected to the radical candidate Fergus O'Connor. I haven't been able to find evidence of this, but I kind of I hope it's true, because he's such an interesting figure. And so what truth might he have been talking about? Well, he was a radical Chartist leader. He was a really celebrated, powerful orator. And he did speak as a candidate at the election rally in Preston in 1837, but he later withdrew as a candidate. So I was reading up on this a couple of weeks ago. He used the opportunity, rather than actually standing as an MP, to rally support from the crowd for his plans to start a national committee for Chartism in London. And you can see there on the screen what the Chartist movement was arguing for, was campaigning for. And he would later be instrumental in the Chartist petition. I think that should be 1838, not 1840. Anyway, sorry, my years. But anyway, so yeah, they were asking for universal male suffrage, annual parliaments, a secret ballot, a salary for MPs, repeal of the Poor Law Act, and repeal of the Act of Union between Britain and Ireland. So this was really radical stuff and really aimed at that kind of the push for social justice, for the ordinary person to have a voice, and to be able to kind of take part in democracy. So was that banner "Truth Will Prevail" connected to Fergus O'Connor? Interestingly, when he gives his speech at the hustings, he spends time pointing out that the Tory candidate is a liar. So he talks about tells the people not to trust the Tory party at this rally. Okay, I'll come back to another suggestion of what that "Truth Will Prevail" might have been referring to a little bit later. But during those sesquicentennial celebrations in 1987, my father brought home a commemorative plate, and it was quickly mounted on the wall in our hallway. It was there for my entire childhood. I really want them to give this to me, but I don't know if they will. And it's still up on their living room wall now, even though they've moved house. So it survived a move. It's still on their wall. But as you can see, I love this object. So, this idea of objects having meaning, I really love it. But also, as you can see on this plate, instead of a depiction of the converts in a British context, on the flag market, by the River Ribble, or anywhere else in Britain, we have them already across the Atlantic, already beyond Nauvoo even, on the trek west, amongst the other saints heading to their new home. And what strikes me about this is how, despite the efforts to acknowledge the significance of their place of origin, they are actually valued only for their willingness to leave it, seen as future pioneers, already assimilated and indistinguishable from their American counterparts. So, as a fiction writer, I now find myself revisiting the simplified narratives I grew up with in order to write a historical novel set in Preston and Nauvoo. And as historians have pointed out, the history of the church in Britain is complex and underexplored. Matthew Rasmussen says it can be tempting to lean on moralistic fables and traditional legends that emerge when tales of British ancestors are passed down through families. So I think this is really interesting. So, the idea of these early saints, I had so little access to their story, to even their names, really, because the ones that are talked about are the ones that left. And so it was very hard to kind of access any sense of who they were, and where their kind of what their occupations were, anything about them. And I wanted to pause for just a minute to talk about the maypole depicted in the British pageant. So this is my link to the burlesque presentation yesterday. Is about talking about maypoles. So as you can see here, you might recognise that in the British pageant, they take the obelisk, that kind of really interesting monument in the centre of Preston, and they turn it into a maypole. And why I find this interesting is the obelisk was built in 1782 as a monument, but in the very early 1800s, they installed a gas lamp, a globe on the top of it. So Preston became the very first city outside of London to have gas street lighting. And that's what the obelisk is now. It still has a gas lamp on the top of it. So to me, the obelisk symbolizes more than anything kind of technology and progress and kind of a pride in that. And the other thing about this is that the flag market in Preston is a very urban space. It's a place of political rallies, as we've already seen. It's a place of commerce. It's a market space. So to me, the maypole is very rural. It's a village based. I actually used to dance the maypole in my village in the 1990s at primary school. And it's very much connected to kind of rural traditions and the turning of the seasons, and it's very complex. So although I can see why it was chosen to do this, it's visually very pleasing on stage. It feels to me perhaps like this is aimed at maybe an American gaze, a kind of sense of a kind of fabulistic merry old England that is kind of pleasing, but maybe again obscuring some of the kind of context of this moment. So Matt Rasmussen goes on to say as well that it's too easy to perpetuate the trope of the heroic missionary who affects change in the people he teaches solely through his charismatic spiritual power. So Matt Rasmussen, this is a quote, he says, elevating the impact of the missionary while ignoring the voluntary religious behavior of new members eliminates half the conversion equation. So a lot of the stories that I grew up with, again, were centered around the powerful preaching of the missionaries. And I knew the missionaries' names, but apart from one or two exceptions, I didn't know the names of those early converts. So, as well as being interested in those narratives of faith and sacrifice and emigration, I'm also, as a writer, really curious about alternative stories. So, what about the converts who stayed behind in Preston, for example, because they couldn't afford to go, or didn't want to, or couldn't bear to leave their families? What about those who lost their faith or found that Zion was not exactly what they expected when they got there? What would it have felt like to be a missionary who began to doubt? And in what ways did the social and political conditions of Preston at the time intersect with those religious concerns and the decision that so many people made to start a new life elsewhere? So now I'm going to talk about my novel. So it has two main protagonists. The first in Nauvoo is Elijah Harris. He's a young herbal physician who struggles to balance his passion for his profession with his efforts to build up the kingdom. And later he will be called to sacrifice his growing practice to travel to England to encourage the saints there to emigrate. Meanwhile, in Preston, we have Martha Aspinall, who is angry at being left behind to care for her difficult father by a sister who's already joined the church and emigrated to Nauvoo. And she is reluctantly drawn into a growing unrest that will lead to a massacre of striking mill workers. So in 1842, there was a general strike happening where many people were walking out of the mills and the factories to protest the working conditions and their pay having gone down at a very, very difficult economic time. So in Preston, this escalated into a situation where the striking mill workers gathered outside Preston's Corn Exchange. And the mayor of Preston read the Riot Act, called in the soldiers, and the soldiers opened fire on men, women, and children. So a small number of people died. Anyway, it was a really it was reported in the national news. It was a really big significant moment, and you can see there outside the Corn Exchange currently we have a commemorative monument to it. Also, what's happening in 1842 that Martha gets drawn into is the Preston Guild, which is a once every 20-year celebration of commerce and civic pride. It's to do with guild charters, the charters that merchants were given to trade in the city, but it becomes much more than that. It's a carnival, it's a celebration. And you can see here some illustrations from the 1842 Guild. And interestingly, you might be able to see there the letterpress printers in the bottom corner. So as I've been researching the Preston Guild, it's written that the letterpress printers had a banner on their wagon that said "Truth Will Prevail." So I kind of sat up straight when I saw that. So again, this phrase is used here, I would argue, probably to indicate the importance of journalistic truth, of the power of the written word. I think that's a really interesting other kind of use of that motto. So when Elijah arrives in Preston as a missionary, he struggles to navigate this volatile landscape and forms a shifting and combative friendship with Martha that will end up changing them both in challenging and unexpected ways. Interestingly, the official guild balls and receptions, there were lots of kind of leisure activities happening for the lower classes, but the upper classes were going to the costume ball and the mayoress's breakfast, and they were held in the Corn Exchange, very, very close to the same place that the massacre had happened only 6 weeks before. So this is a really interesting time of upheaval, followed by kind of carnival and celebration. So as Brian E. Stocker asserts, imagining and inventing may be what the writer does, but combining that with the traces of the past is the central challenge of historical fiction. So in order to imagine my way into the subjective experience of my characters, to narrate not only what happens, but to imagine how it might feel, I have to develop a complex sense of the factors that have formed them, their histories, fears, and motivations. As the writer Hilary Mantel argues, our characters have to come onto the page with a hinterland, what they read, what music they listened to, the metaphors that govern their lives, the tales they heard as children. And we learn about them by listening and looking as well as by reading, by rearranging our senses if we have to, and certainly by rearranging our ethical framework and questioning our assumptions about human nature. So if the wider context of my characters is not explored fully enough, or is based on partial and flawed mediations of history, this can have a negative impact on the complexity or believability of the fiction. And before returning to my own novel, I want to examine this effect in 2 historical novels that depict characters from Britain who join the church and make the journey across the Atlantic in those early years. And as a writer, criticizing other writers' works is always a little bit risky, but I'm going to risk it tonight. So hopefully you'll enjoy, along with me, some examples of what I think is not working so well. So the first novel is Saints by Orson Scott Card, also released as A Woman of Destiny. It's published in 1984. It follows a family from Manchester who struggle through the hardships of the Industrial Revolution. And when I say struggle, I mean the first third of this novel is literally just struggle. They never laugh. They never do anything but just struggle. And before they meet Heber C. Kimball in 1837. And this meeting transforms the life of half of the family who decide to emigrate to Nauvoo, but also creates division and separation with the family members who decide to stay in England. So the first third of the book is set in England. It predominantly depicts terrible hardship. There is an effort here to establish the characters firmly in their context, but there's also a strange lack of detail and blankness in the description of the setting. I'm going to read a part of a scene. In this scene, Robert, who will ultimately choose to stay in Manchester, has been attending a very vaguely described political meeting that he leaves early out of boredom. The courtyard was fairly clean, but that only meant that the stench was barely endurable. A child came out of one of the inner-facing cottages and squatted in a corner of the yard, unperturbed by Robert's frank observation. This is the common man, Robert thought. Give them all the rights they clamour for, and what will they do with them? He tried to imagine his mother letting him shit in a corner, even when he was a child. Unthinkable. Some people were born low, Robert knew, for all that theorists shouted about equality. Most people, perhaps. Most people are exactly where they belong in life. Only a few of the rich deserve to be low, those who squander their fortunes, and only a few of the poor deserve to be rich, those with the courage and drive to achieve wealth. He looked up and saw no stars. There were no stars to be seen. The smoke looped over the city, preparing to pounce. At times like this, it felt heavy and oppressive. Okay, I'm not going to spend a long time analysing what I don't like about that passage, but there's all I'm going to say is there's a lot of poo happening in this novel. People just poo in corners and in houses all the time, and there's also no sense of the collective in this part of the book. No depiction of community or wider connection. No sense that the characters have any particular spiritual, cultural, or political longings. And of course, I'm not trying to claim that Manchester or Preston were easy places to live in the mid-1800s. It's true that they were rife with inequality, pollution, illiteracy, terrible working conditions, but these were also radical and religious places. Alongside Catholic and Anglican communities, there were many nonconformist branches of Christianity, including Sunday schools offering free education, public lectures, reading rooms, friendly societies, movements for workers' rights like Chartism, and not to mention a wide range of entertainment and leisure activities, some much healthier than others. But in this book, these things are either generalized, reduced to easy Dickensian stereotypes like a boy apprenticed to be a chimney sweep, or completely absent. Later in the novel, the main character, Dinah, is considering abandoning her husband and young children to travel to Zion. She expresses her longing and motivation for the journey to her concerned mother. She says, "What an empty land this England is. We're foreigners here, mother. I want to go home." Manchester does feel like an empty place in this book, not only metaphorically because the characters are ground down by it, but also literally because I would argue the author hasn't done enough research to really imagine it into being. My second example is from the epic multi-book series, The Work and the Glory. In the 1990s, I used to go in people's houses and they would have these big doorstop, the collection of the series. I never read them personally, but I knew a lot of people who had these in their houses. And in this part that I'm going to read out, this is from, it's 1840, and a character called Derek returns to his hometown of Preston as a missionary after having earlier emigrated to America. So here he's on the train to Preston, not able to see out the window through the darkness, closing his eyes to rely on his memories about his hometown instead. Here the river was wide and deep, moving slowly with barely a ripple. On the north side would be the city proper, with the endless rows of 2- and 3-story apartment buildings that overlooked the river. These were the nicer housing complexes. Behind them, between the river and the great textile factories, would be the housing for the poor, grey-black apartment houses. The streets and alleys no more than a rabbit's warren, where the labouring poor crammed 8 and 12 deep into one-room flats. So I have a few issues with this description, and I suppose I'm allowed to because Preston's my hometown, and I know it isn't Gerald Lund's hometown, so I do get that. Research is hard. But I'm going to go for it anyway. So this section of the River Ribble that runs through Preston is tidal. So there is no part of it that's always deep and slow moving. We're on an estuary. Most of the buildings in Preston are built with red brick, Accrington brick, from a local quarry, not the black and grey cited in the passage. And in general, Preston is described here as if it came to being as an industrial town at the same time as the textile industry, with all the factories clustered together and planned divisions between rich and poor housing, almost like it's built on a grid system. But in fact, Preston is an ancient market town, transformed by industry. And in depictions of the city from this time, you can see the scattering of factory chimneys amongst church spires, residential areas encroached on by businesses, gasworks, tanneries, shops, public parkland, gardens and canals. It's all mixed up. Just like the Manchester depicted in Saints, the Preston in this book is reduced only to poverty, division, and industry. And just as there's no pre-industry for the cities, there seems to be no pre-existing spiritual life for the characters. In fact, it often feels as though they only came into consciousness when they encountered the Mormon church. So even though we are asked to believe that Derek has complex feelings about returning to his home in this scene, this can be only communicated through tropes and generalities. He has no real history here, no specific memories of this place, so we can't really access a nuanced version of his emotions. And I just got one more quote that kind of demonstrates it. So instead of remembering an encounter with a family member or a friend or a place that he used to go to, this is how he describes kind of approaching his hometown. He could almost smell the open sewage running down the streets and alleyways, the stench of half-rotten cabbage cooking in pots with very little meat. He could almost hear the clatter of the wooden shoes worn by the factory workers, the raucous shouts of the gaunt-eyed children playing games with a stick and a rock, darting in and out of the great cotton wagons which thundered by day and night. So yeah, his hometown is reduced to smelling of cabbage, and I don't know what game children are playing with a stick and a rock. A stick and a hoop I could go with, but a stick and a rock, I don't know how that works. In other ways, this book and this series shows really, really attention to history. You know, the end of the chapters often has a list of all the sources that we used. There's a desire to honor it. And it's also true to say that the emphasis, I think, is more on the wide sweep of history rather than particular subjective experiences. But I would still argue that the experiences of faith and sacrifice were given in the books are diminished if we don't know enough about a character to understand what they wrestle with, what loyalties they find themselves caught between, and what they ultimately have to leave behind. Rose Tremaine says that all the work, all the research done for a novel, all the studying and reading, all the social field work, all the location visiting and the garnering of what is or what has been must be imagined before it can find a place in the text. It must rise into the orbit of the anarchic, gift-conjuring, unknowing part of the novelist's mind before it can acquire its own truth for the work in question. So I can't really give you an exact description of how the balance of research and imagination works in my novel because it's kind of not like that. It's very, very chaotic and often unconscious. But what I do want to do is share some of the most useful historical sources I've encountered, and then a part of my draft where hopefully you'll see the way that they've risen up. So, for example, I was fascinated by a series of articles in the Preston Chronicle outlining the dangers of Mormonism and concluding with comic sketches written in exaggerated Lancashire dialect, mocking the intelligence of the new converts. You might hear an echo of that later. But also the way that these outraged articles about the dangers of Mormonism are surrounded by advertisements for medical cure-alls, notices of bankruptcy, train timetables, articles about rising political unrest, and advertisements for concerts and lectures and social events. So really situating, it really helped me remember, you know, there's other things going on at the same time. I'm a big fan of William Clayton's 1840 Manchester Missionary Journal. William Clayton was from Penwitham, which I can literally see out of my window across the river. And in his journal, he recounts dreams and revelations alongside his attempts to deal with gossip, petty grievances, disaffection, rebellion. He documents all the gifts he's given. For some reason, he'd been giving a lot of oranges in 1840, meals that he eats alongside the lingering presence of charismatic practices, including women administering blessings and anointing people with rum and washing the feet of the elders. There's other things I could go into. There's other I might bring some more sources in later, but I'm going to read a section of my novel now, and hopefully you'll see the traces of some of those things rising up here. So this is from the Preston part of my novel, where my character Martha is leaving a scientific lecture to go home and confront her father, who has volunteered her to work on a committee without her permission. So yeah, I'm going to just read this section and hopefully you'll see some of these things coming through. In the cluttered back room, her father was already asleep, a plate of crumbs teetering on the arm of the chair. It was a disappointment. Now she had to swallow the words she'd been carrying all the way home. In this light, he looked frail and slumped. The pain in his shoulder and back that made him hunch over, made him bite his lips raw and worry at the loose skin so that they were more often bleeding than not. She stepped forward. He was holding the blue scrapbook against his chest. He groaned and shifted. The book slipped down and a piece of paper came loose. An article from the Chronicle he hadn't managed to paste in yet. She cleared some pamphlets off a chair and lit the lamp. Mercenary Mormonites will employ any means to usher their flocks to Zion, it read. And underneath it, yet another list of offences. The audacity of a founder who thought he could add new scripture to the Bible, who claimed to be a seer like prophets of old, who sent out missionaries requiring their new followers to give up furniture and china, precious heirlooms that could be sold to fund the latest charter ship across the Atlantic. And all of it followed by a sketch, some smug journalist's rendition of the comic Poor. In it, Bessie Doodle and Dickie Crosscotton debated the merits of this strange city called Nauvoo, with their exaggerated reets and e-by gums. "Hey, Bessie," she read now, from somewhere half down the page. "Hast the heard? When we get to that there Zion, we'll be greeted on dock by a choir of angels, and get to shake hands with the prophet Joseph, and there'll be sweet honey dripping down from all trees." As if the only people who made that journey were dim-witted. It was more complicated than that. She had seen all sorts fall under their spell. Methodists and Unitarians, people of solid faith and more tentative seekers, tradesmen and overlookers, seamstresses and bricklayers, even a policeman, it was said, although he struggled to hold on to his position once word got out. She had seen her own sister, locally renowned amongst the primitive Methodists for inspired sermonizing, and commonly believed to be of sound mind, grow silent when these men preached on the street. It was unaccountable, the way they drew her in. Even after their father had forbidden any contact, Martha had heard voices from the parlour late one night, crept downstairs, and seen Helen, kneeling in front of an overly groomed American elder, folding up his trouser cuffs, peeling off his worn stockings, and tenderly bathing his feet. Okay, so that's the end of the extract. And I just wanted to kind of bring through some of those kind of archival kind of things that I've been looking at, the way that they come to show you the way that they've been coming through in the novel. I'm also going to show you very quickly, when I was at the British Library, I was lucky enough to be able to handle some really kind of old documents. And this is a kind of image from an 1848, I think, European collection of Latter-day Saint hymns. And I was able to kind of hold this book and see, you can see that it's annotated. I love marginalia. I love seeing what people write in books. And somebody has written all over this in pencil. And I wasn't able to decipher all of it, but what I could decipher is a really kind of earnest outpouring of spiritual hope and kind of a declaration of faith, really. And to be able to kind of see things like this really reminds me of how, as well as questioning the narratives that I grew up with, I'm really also interested in one of the biggest challenges in my fiction is, how do you depict faith? How do you depict the experience of feeling something beyond the real, a connection to the divine? That's also something that I'm really interested in doing in this book. So just as the process of writing fiction is a kind of circulating exchange between the drafting, the research, and the feedback, I'm interested in the circulating connections between historical fiction and the existing historical sources and narratives. So as Jerome de Groot argues, historical fictions first contribute to the historical imaginary, having an almost pedagogical aspect in allowing us a culture to understand past moments. Second, they allow reflection upon the representational processes of history. They provide a means to critique, conceptualize, engage with, and reject the process of representation or narrativization. So this idea that sometimes, I read historical fiction, sometimes that's my way into a part of history that I knew nothing about. And this book might end up doing that for people. But I think I'm more interested in reimagining those narratives that I grew up with, thinking about the lacks that I felt that they had, and thinking about how to complicate, to reimagine, and to really reintegrate those two parts of my life, the novel reading part and the religious part that felt so separate to me back then. My brain didn't couldn't really put them together, even though the novels I were reading were often written or set at the same time period as the church history that I was being told. So yes, as well as revisiting the history I grew up with, drawing on it, and perhaps in some cases introducing readers to it, what I'm most interested in while developing my novel in some ways is bringing back together important parts of my identity that used to feel separate, and to see what happens as I attempt to complicate, integrate, and reimagine them. And I think that's all I've got. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll give folks a minute. Type in some questions if you've got any questions. I wanted to ask you a question if I
Mm,
can. So when you talk about writing a book and how sometimes these characters can be missing that sort of richness, that depth, you understand their motivations and such. Oh, Andrew Bolton says applause. That's his. He wants to make sure
thanks,
you can hear
Andrew.
their clapping from there. How much of that, when you set out to write a character, how much of that is research, where you
Mm.
find maybe a character to base the person in your novel off of, and how much of that is assumed, right, based on like little hints in the book? How much are you able to actually pull? Because you said there's really sparse information about some of these folks.
Yeah, so none of the characters in my book, my main characters are not based on anyone real. So I was going to say none of my characters in the book are real people, but that's not true because Joseph Smith features. So that in Nauvoo, there are real figures in the background, but all of the foreground characters that I'm working with, I've made up. Definitely, I don't consciously base my characters on real people, mostly because I find it more interesting to kind of go into the imagination. But definitely parts of research come up. So my main character in Preston is called Martha, and one of the strands in the novel is her estrangement from her sister, and the way that her sister's emigration has not only divided them physically, but actually they have argued about it, and she feels abandoned and betrayed and very bitter. So they're not even really corresponding, or wishing each other well. There's a lot of anger there. And I didn't realize until I was kind of looking back at some of my research, but I'm pretty sure that this is inspired by Martha Brotherton and her sister. So a lot of people may be familiar with the Martha Brotherton story, that she was from Manchester. She's famous for claiming that Brigham Young locked her in a room and tried to get her to agree to be his first polygamous wife, his first plural wife. And she later spoke out about this, very, very boldly and publicly. And what I didn't realize was that I think the rest of her family left Nauvoo along with her, but her sister stayed. And the reason I know this is because her sister writes a letter that is published in the Millennial Star, which is the Mormon paper that is read by the saints in England. And in this letter, she says, "Don't believe anything my sister says. It's still true. The prophet's still a prophet. Please come. Don't not emigrate because of this." And what I was fascinated by that is the sisters, is that sisterly relationship and the division between them. So I think that's a really good example of where I think that's come through in the novel, but it hasn't come through in a very literal, direct way. The sisters in my novel are not Martha Brotherton and her sister, but one of them ended up becoming Martha without me realizing that I was doing that. And also, I'm really interested in this dynamic of estrangement because of the church. So although it's not based on them, I think it's kind of risen up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You also talked a little bit about the passage about that river being different, just like the way that river moves in Work in the Glory. Do you have a like strategy that you follow when you're writing about a specific place? I would assume you visit. If not, no offense intended. But do you have like a checklist you go through? What are the things that you look for when you're writing about a place to make sure that you are communicating it authentically?
I mean, obviously, the Preston part of the novel, I live here and I'm right in the middle, but also I can't go back to Preston in 1842 either. So even the Preston part requires a lot of research. Um, I don't really have a checklist. I I think sometimes just being in a place, I do take photos, um, but it's more the being in a place and being I because I did visit Nauvoo a couple of years ago. I got the opportunity to go. Andrew recommended that I go to the John Whitmer Historical Association conference when it was in Independence, and I did a road trip to Nauvoo, and I think that was really important. Even just to get the sense of how the gradient of like the hill that runs up to the temple, it's just the feel of the land, the smells of the air, things like that I think are really important. But I also think it is possible to write just with research, and I have done that occasionally in the past. Sometimes you can't afford to go to the location, or it doesn't exist anymore in
Right.
any form that would be helpful. So for me, it's more like atmosphere. It's taking some photos, it's experiencing it. I write notes, but I don't have a kind of really checklist. And some of the scenes that end up being most powerful sometimes are not based in anywhere real that I've researched. They just, again, from imagination. So it's a real mixture.
It's incredible. As someone that loves to read, but cannot write, I find that so interesting that you can just create that. That's beautiful. See, Kathy, we have a question from Kathy. She says, when do you expect to have finished the book and to see it published? Looking forward to reading it.
Thank you, Kathy. That I knew this question would come. I'm hoping to be able to send the book out to publishers early next year. But every time I put a date on it, it always moves because it's taking me a lot. And that's partly has been life circumstance. I had a really bad couple of years health wise that really slowed down my progress, and I also work full time at a university. And anyway, so yeah, I'm hoping early next year, and I am getting towards the end of the novel now, and really enjoying it. But I'm quite a slow writer, unfortunately.
For folks on Facebook, I linked your site, naomikruger.com. Can people check in there for news on your book? Will it be up?
Yes, yeah, I will absolutely update that if I have any news. Yeah.
Okay, you heard that, naomikruger.com. Check that site for news on the book. Andrew asks, sorry, my dog's in the background. This is the risk of uh, presenting from my house. Do you go into the exploitation of Lancashire people in Nauvoo, the women into polygamy, the men also exploited, used, and disappointed with Zion?
Thanks, Andrew. That's a really good question. The answer is yes. I have a couple of really like grumpy Lancashire characters in Nauvoo, and that was really important to me because one of the things that, and I think I've spoken to Andrew about this before, I never recognized. I think the first time that I really the converts felt real to me was when I was reading about them complaining. um, Preston people are very warm, we're very nice people, but like we're complainers also. We're quite stubborn, there's a stubbornness about us. And so the depictions of converts that are just all sweetness and acceptance and sacrifice didn't fully ring true with me. So I definitely have some characters who are not happy with the conditions. They feel cheated. They feel that they're not getting what they were promised. And when it comes to polygamy, that's a little trickier because my main kind of focal character is not in the inner circle. So he is going to encounter rumors and he is going to see things that kind of hint towards that. But in 1842, he's leaving on his mission just before the John C. Bennett sort of scandals are starting to break. And so I want the hints to be there. He's actually going to hear about polygamy for the first time in Preston through newspaper articles, which I think is quite interesting. The articles were there in 1842. The scandal, the John C. Bennett scandal, made it across the Atlantic pretty quickly. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Type them in. I can see on Facebook and on Zoom. So if anybody has another question, we've got time for a couple more. Nicola on Facebook just has a comment. So the time in LDS history, she's always found fascinating. As I've always thought, the narrative and perspective shared in the pageant and retelling is more complex. Looking forward to the book.
Yeah, and was talking about the pageant earlier, and I should probably give a disclaimer, and that is that I know that to a lot of people it's very meaningful, especially people who participate in it. The community spirit of it I really admire, but I agree. I find the narrative, and I know pageants are in some ways stylized and simplified, and that's part of the form. But yeah, I feel the same.
Thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else that we can shout out before we give you your evening back?
Just if anyone's interested in reading, and you could find a link to this, I think. Yeah, on my website, there's a link to the story that was mentioned in my bio, which is In My Father's House and Many Mansions. So it's really meaningful to me. There's a link, you can read it free online. And it might be of interest to people from Sunstone UK, because as you were saying, it's in a contemporary Mormon chapel. You might recognize some features of the kind of setting of the story. And it was the first thing I've ever published that deals with the my kind of background, LDS background. So I felt very, very vulnerable coming out, but I feel like this has broken the back now, so I can just kind of write about anything now and just get it out there. So yeah, if people are interested in my writing and they want to kind of sample it, and read something that is connected to LDS culture, maybe go and check that out.
Thank you for being a part of the conference. That was beautiful, incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, it was great. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, well, have a lovely night. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll see y'all soon.